So let's get started. Let's begin with a reminder about the risks of flooding. These are some FEMA facts that may help us to understand a little bit about the impact of flood risk. In the special flood hazard area, there's a 5 times greater risk of damages from flooding than there is from a fire over the life of a typical mortgage. Flood damage repair can be very costly, even if the flooding appears to be minimal. And almost 30% of all NFIP flood insurance claims come from outside of the special flood hazard area. As a matter of fact, in the big flood that Houston had last year, almost 60% of the flood claims were from areas not in the special flood hazard area. So it's important to understand the flood risks when someone is selling or buying a property in the FEMA mapped flood hazard area. And you ask the question, why do people buy properties that are at a risk of flooding? Actually, you wouldn't ask that question because as realtors, you probably know they want a beautiful view, they like the neighborhood, they want to be close to a beach or lake shore. They find that living on the water gives them a sense of peace or tranquility, or the property just may be affordable. Whatever their reason, they're preparing to enter into the realm of flood risk, and they need to know what they're getting into as much as can be discovered. And your job includes helping them to find out what's at stake. A flood insurance policy is an owner's first line of defense against flood damages. Here are some facts about flood insurance. Homeowner policies that cover theft and fire almost never cover flooding, with the rare exception of some manufactured home policies or a specially written private policy. The average disaster assistance payout to owners who do not have a flood policy after a federally declared disaster and do not qualify for a small business administration loan is usually less than $10,000, compared with an average NFIP policy claim payout of about $62,000. And those are 2016 figures. And if the flood is not a federally declared disaster, then there will be no payout from anyone for damages without a flood policy. Even a homeowner at the top of a mountain can purchase an NFIP policy. There are preferred rates for properties located away from flood sources that can be as low as $300 or $400 a year. You can Google NFIP preferred rate policy and find out more information about this for your clients who are not in FEMA's mapped special flood hazard areas. Because remember, 25 to 30% of all claims occur outside the special flood hazard area, and Mother Nature doesn't follow the flood lines on the map. As you know, Massachusetts is a caveat emptor or buyer beware state, meaning that there's not a whole lot that a seller is legally required to disclose to the buyer when selling her property. The burden is on the buyer to ask the right questions and perform a home inspection in order to determine the property's physical condition, features, and noticeable past damages from flooding. A realtor's reputation can be based in part upon helping a buyer to get as much information as possible and by helping a seller to provide as much information as possible. For example, an agent can look up the flood zone of a home before discussing the potential sale. You can Google FEMA's Map Service Center and type in the address to see whether or not the property is in the special flood hazard area. You can also call our office at 617-626-1406 and we'll help you look at the flood map. The last slide in this presentation does have all of these contact numbers again for your use. So we know that in Massachusetts, disclosure law for an ordinary home sale is very light. Most agents request the completion of a disclosure form, which contains whatever information the seller is quote unquote aware of. Typically, if a seller is truly interested in selling the property, she'll be glad to disclose whatever information is known. If a disclosure form is checked as completed and signed, then the buyer may have some legal ground if it's later discovered that known information was not disclosed. Also, if it can later be proven that information was concealed, fraudulent, or deliberately misleading, there may be legal ramifications for the seller. One real estate firm in Massachusetts requires that if a seller refuses to complete the disclosure form, she must sign a refusal statement for the realtor's file. So how can we find out about flood risk? These are some of the sources we'll look at in order to get a full picture of what the risk for a certain property might be. On the FEMA Map Service Center, you can search by address for the flood map that includes the property. This graphic shows a FEMA fermet, which is an official portion of the FEMA map panel for the site. The small red marker you can see in the center of the map portion indicates the site of an address that was entered. You can see that this structure is partially in the special flood hazard area, which is denoted by the blue color. When I visited with you last November, I took you through a tutorial of sorts to show you how to use this resource. You can find that presentation on the MAR website, or again, you can call me in my office and I'll walk you through the use of the site. The official FEMA flood map is the best way to introduce a potential buyer to the first fact about their flood risk, even when the property is completely out of this special flood hazard area. So I want to go over a few tools that a seller can present that would help give information about the flood risk on the site. And this number one tool is called the elevation certificate. And what you're seeing on the screen is just a portion of the elevation certificate. So this certificate is completed by a surveyor, engineer, or architect. Typical cost in Massachusetts runs between $800 and $1,000 for this form. The completed form is recognized by FEMA and flood insurance agents as officially certifying specific pieces of information about a structure in the floodplain that will help them to understand the flood risk. If a seller has a copy of an elevation certificate that he can share with a prospective buyer, that will demonstrate a willingness to be transparent in the sale and will allow the buyer to get an exact rate quote from an insurance agent. Here's one section of the form. You can see that the surveyor must list the height above sea level for the land around the structure in items, for example, F, G, and H, plus the height of parts of the building. In another section of this form, the surveyor lists the elevation of the 1% chance flood. This is called the base flood and is often referred to as the 100-year flood. So, for example, if the height of the bottom floor, shown in item A, is lower than the base flood elevation listed in section B of the form, one can expect that the structure will be flooded when the 1% chance flood occurs. The property is then rated so that the annual premium reflects this risk. In other cases, the height of the bottom floor will be higher than the base flood, reflecting a lower flood risk and annual premium. And by the way, a basement is considered to be the bottom floor. Homes with basements in the floodplain typically pay a much higher annual premium than homes without basements. An elevation certificate remains effective until the structure or the property has been changed in some way as to render the measurements no longer true. So how do you know if there is an elevation certificate for a certain structure? Perhaps a previous owner had one completed and the current owner may not be aware of that. There are several options to finding an existing elevation certificate. I can say, though, that in Massachusetts, it's much more often that we find no elevation certificate associated with a structure because all but 21 communities do not require the use of this FEMA form. Even in these 21 communities, structures that were built before the requirement will typically have no elevation certificate on file. If there is an existing elevation certificate, here are the steps to find it. Ask the seller if they have an elevation certificate. If they do, tell them you want to make a copy for prospective buyers. This will greatly help the potential buyer to get a proper flood insurance quote so that there will be no surprises on closing day. If the owner does not have an elevation certificate, contact the local building department. If an elevation certificate was ever required for new construction or for past work on the structure, they might have it on file. Sometimes the local conservation commission keeps those forms in their files. For local contact information, you can go to the Massachusetts Municipal Organization website at mma.org and click on City and Town websites. If the community doesn't have an elevation certificate for the address, ask the seller to ask their flood insurance agent if an elevation certificate was used to obtain the rating for their policy. If so, the agent should be able to provide a copy. As a last resort, if the seller is aware of a previous flood insurance policy on the structure, perhaps with a former owner, that insurance agent may have a copy. Remember, the elevation certificate is good forever until the structure or land has been altered so that the measurements on the certificate are no longer true. A second tool that a seller can use is called the letter of map amendment. And I want to explain what I mean by saying that the seller can use this. Sometimes a structure on a site is not in the special flood hazard area, but a portion of the property may be. So for example, if you have a home on a riverfront, the portion of the site of the parcel that fronts the river may be in the special flood hazard area, but the structure or the home that's up by the street or the road may not be in the special flood hazard area. Frequently, a policy will be rated based on the fact that some portion of the parcel is in the flood hazard area. But, and a seller can get a letter of map amendment that shows that only the land is in the special flood hazard area and the structure is not. It's a free process that FEMA offers, and so let me just take you through this a little bit without trying to get you in too deeply. If you notice in the center of the screen here, there's a box with a heavy border, and at the top it says outcome. And you can see that FEMA has determined in this piece of this letter of map amendment that the structure has been removed from the special flood hazard area. It doesn't really mean that the property is not in the special flood hazard area, but it means that the structure is not. So if you look, you can also see, look to the right of that box, you'll see that the base flood elevation is shown as 6.8 feet, and the lowest adjacent grade next to the home is more than 3 feet higher than the base flood elevation. This is why FEMA determined that the structure is out of the floodplain because it is located on a part of the land that's higher than the base flood elevation. And why would this make a difference? If the seller is not paying for flood insurance currently, and there's many reasons why that might be the case, you can help ensure that there are no closing day surprises for the buyer by finding out ahead of time whether or not the buyer will be required to have a policy. So a bank, we're going to talk about how the bank finds out whether or not there's a special flood hazard area on the property. But at this point, let's just say that if the seller has no mortgage on the house, they're not required to have a policy. But if the property is in the special flood hazard area, a new buyer will have to have a policy if they plan to mortgage the home. So there may be a way for the seller to qualify the property by obtaining this letter of map amendment from FEMA. The buyer can then use a copy of this official FEMA letter before the closing to either be released from the lender's mandatory purchase requirement or to get a very affordable policy, which of course is recommended. So if there's a chance that the structure or the property may not actually be in the special flood hazard area, you can Google FEMA letter of map amendment and find the instructions for the seller to obtain this free FEMA determination. If you have other questions about letter of map amendment, you can call our office and we can explain the process and send some of the instructions to you, but we don't have a role in this FEMA process. So another tool that a seller has to help be transparent about flood risk on their property is their own flood insurance policy. A seller can share a copy of her policy, at least the declarations page, with a potential buyer so that the buyer can see the coverage, the current deductible, and the amount of the annual premium. It's possible, however, that a mistake may have been made and the buyer can take the copy to her insurance agent to ask if there could possibly be a lower premium available. So here's where my lack of insurance knowledge could get me in trouble. So let me just say, there are multiple reasons why a policy examination could turn up something of benefit to the buyer. Things like grandfathering, built-in compliance, and newly mapped could result in a possible premium deduction or reduction that a good flood insurance agent could apply if applicable. And it's not uncommon that an existing property owner with a flood insurance policy wouldn't know that they could have had a reduced premium if they don't touch base with their insurance agent every year and check up on that policy premium. Also, from time to time, there are flood insurance policies that are not transferable to the new owner. If this happens, the buyer will have to buy a new policy, which can be much higher in cost than the previous owner's policy was. It's good to know about this ahead of time also. Be sure the buyer asks if the policy is transferable well in advance of a closing day surprise. And again, the buyer would be asking a flood insurance agent about that. Finally, a common surprise at closing is when the seller was living in the home as their primary residence, but the buyer will be using the home as a secondary residence. There are higher fees and surcharges for a secondary home policy, and the glide path for premium increases is 25% per year if the previous policy was subsidized and is transferable. So I'm going to give you at the end at the last slide the name of FEMA's regional insurance expert, and he knows everything about the ins and outs of flood insurance. He serves all of New England. His services are free. His name is Tom Young, and he works out of an office in New Hampshire. So I'll give you his phone number and email at the end of this presentation, and certainly feel free to call him with any question about flood insurance policies or real estate transactions. And the last tool that a seller has available to help a policy, help a potential buyer be attracted to his or her property in the floodplain is mitigation. And you may know about this. So if none of the previous options reduce the flood insurance policy or risk to a tolerable level for the potential buyer, the seller could consider doing some mitigation actions. They can mitigate the equipment. Simply elevating the equipment that services the home can bring a reduction in the annual premium. You want to make sure to check with the insurance agent first to be sure that the actual actions that will be taken in each case would have a positive effect on the policy rating. And number two, if a seller has a basement, it may be that he can remove and elevate the equipment in the basement, typically furnace, water heater, laundry facilities, and then abandon the basement. This involves filling in the basement and installing flood openings so that floodwaters can flow unimpeded beneath the home during a flood event. An engineer can give your seller an estimate for this work, but be sure to check with the insurance agent beforehand to verify that these specific actions will indeed result in a lower annual premium. And by the way, I recently heard of an owner in Wareham who did this and reduced an annual flood insurance premium from $27,000 per year to $940 per year. This is an extreme case, but it all happened with abandoning the first floor, which was a basement of that structure. And finally, a seller can install flood openings. In some cases, that installation of flood openings into a building's crawl space can reduce the premium. You can ask the insurance agent what difference that might make and get an estimate from an engineer. Oh, I must have been on the wrong slide the whole time. Sorry about that. So in all of this, the lender is crucial to those closing day surprises that we don't like to have. And the lender has certain obligations under the National Flood Insurance Program, including specific notifications to buyers and sellers and the mandate of having a flood insurance policy if any portion of the property is found to be in the special flood hazard area. These actions by the lender protect the federal investment in the home, which resides in the federally backed mortgage. So it's the lender's responsibility to determine whether the home is in the special flood hazard area or not, and they usually accomplish that through the use of a third-party determination company. These firms are pretty good, but they don't always get the determination right, and they don't consider whether the actual structure is in the special flood hazard area or whether just some portion of the land. As we said earlier, the back parcel against the river might be in the flood hazard area, but the structure itself might not. Typically, a third-party determination company will say that the parcel is in the floodplain, and the lender will then say, you have to have flood insurance. The lender also doesn't often give much time before closing to let the buyer know that flood insurance may be required. And it's up to the buyer or the new policyholder to prove the third-party determination wrong. So if that happens where a buyer thinks that the third-party determination that the lender is presenting is possibly wrong, it's up to the buyer or the person who's getting the flood policy to prove that the home is not in the flood hazard area. And again, we do that through the use of the elevation certificate and the letter of map amendment. So a buyer can be prepared for this by obtaining the FEMA Flood first so that he can look at what the determination company will be looking at, and also getting a hold of an elevation certificate and, if needed, a letter of map amendment. Those documents, the elevation certificate and letter of map amendment, are official documents that a lender is allowed to consider and to change their mind about mandatory flood insurance. So if the buyer is purchasing a new policy rather than transferring an existing policy, the buyer will have to have an elevation certificate anyway in order to purchase the new policy. So you can help your buyer by assisting them to get as much of this information in advance of the closing, so they'll be able to know what their premium cost will be as soon as possible. Obviously, an average policy of $1,200 a year is vastly different than a policy quoted at $8,000 a year or higher. So let's look at the list we began with. We've covered the importance of looking at the FEMA Flood Map, the value of having an elevation certificate, seller disclosure requirements, and the insurance policy. There are a few more things a buyer can do in order to best understand the flood risk of her new home. Let's talk about flood loss history. A property owner, so I apologize, a buyer cannot do this, but the owner can get FEMA's record of flood claims paid since 1978 for that property. Only the owner can do this because this information is protected by the 1974 Federal Privacy Act. So again, only the owner can get this. No one can actually force an owner to get this. If they want to get it, they can get it, and I'll tell you how. And if the information is good, they can share that with the potential buyer and say, see, there's only been one claim on this property. It was way back in 1980. Things have changed, whatever. But often, if they do have information on this list, it may be multiple losses, multiple claims, and the amount of the damage is shown versus the fair market value of the structure at that point in time. So if an owner wants their own flood insurance loss history, they can contact the NFIP Loss History Department at the phone number there, 1-866-395-7496. They'll need to press number 1, press number 2, because what they're looking for is their flood insurance loss history. And the operator or customer service representative who finally answers will provide an affidavit for the caller to sign that assures that they are the current owner of the property, after which they'll send the loss history either by email or by postal service, whichever is requested. They can also mail a request to the NFIP Help Center, which is at P.O. Box 310 in Lanham, Maine. That's Lanham, Lanham, Maine at 20703 zip code. But again, calling is pretty easy. And again, only the current owner of the property can get that. I would recommend that they do if they're in the special flood hazard area. It may enlighten them as to what past losses are that they didn't know about. One cautionary note, once the owner has this information, future disclosure statements would need to have those records attached as known information. And then obviously a buyer should pay for a property inspection by a certified property inspector, especially one who's knowledgeable about signs of previous flood damages. Also, speaking with neighbors and others who live in the area that may be aware of past local flooding is advised. Finally, a potential buyer can contact a local planning office, Conservation Commission, or building department to see what information those local officials might have regarding flooding in the location or neighborhood. My office works with local communities on a daily basis, and when we visit with them and ask, so where does your community flood? They always can tell you the name of the streets, the neighborhoods, they know where it floods. So that's a good way for a buyer to do some extra homework and contact those folks, especially departments of public works usually have pretty good information about stormwater flooding in the area, which may not be reflected on the FEMA maps. So because the NFIP is a 5-year program, federal program, it's currently in the reform phase. And there are some significant reform proposals currently in Congress which may affect flood damage disclosure requirements in the future if these proposals are passed and incorporated into the NFIP as we move forward in the next 5 years. So House Resolution 2874 basically proposes that no new flood insurance coverage will be available for a property unless the appropriate body imposes a duty on the seller or lessor to provide disclosure, including actual knowledge, prior insurance claims, and any federal obligations to maintain flood insurance. There's a lot more in that resolution. I just pulled out the key pieces. And you might want to know that there are some properties that are required by law to maintain a flood insurance policy for the life of the property. Those properties would include any properties that would have the federal investment of a mitigation grant or a small business administration loan, and those kinds of federal investments where if you're in the special flood hazard area, you must have a policy. Senate Bill 1313 would require a seller or a lessor to provide a specific FEMA flood risk pamphlet, disclose the flood risk profile, including past flood damages and claims, and the designation of a property if it's designated as a repetitive loss property or a severe repetitive loss property, which are designations that FEMA has on thousands of properties across the country. Fortunately, in Massachusetts, we only have about 3,000 rep loss properties and just about 200 severe repetitive loss properties, but it's still a good thing to know about. And Senate Bill 1368 would require landlords to disclose the flood zone that the property's in, including the flood insurance coverage that's on the building and availability of contents coverage for renters. Senate Bill 1571 is very similar to the House proposal. So these things are in the works and they're in committees, and we'll just have to see how that all turns out over time. So some resources that as realtors you may want. At the top, I've put the FEMA distribution center for their publications, warehouse, and materials. There's a toll-free phone number there. I've listed 5 brochures here that we've given out in the past and realtors have been glad to have but there are more. So you can Google NFIP resources for realtors, and you can download these yourself and print them out and hand them out, or you can get the publications for free in limited numbers from the FEMA warehouse. You can also ask them for their catalogs so that you can see other available FEMA resources. And finally, FEMA's FloodSmart website is back up again. Just go to floodsmart.gov. You might let your potential buyers know about that website, because there's information about flood insurance policies and things on that website for them also. And finally, here are the contact information for us. The top is my email and phone number. Eric Carlson works with me. He's very good at helping people go through the letters of map amendment process, and he's very good with building code requirements. Both of us can help you out with mitigation discussions. And then again, Tom Young, who is truly an expert at all things dealing with flood insurance policies and helping folks to see if there's a possibility that they might somehow be available for a lower premium. So I hope this was helpful to you today, and thanks again for letting me come and share with you. We always look forward to helping realtors with their clients, especially to understand the flood risk when buying or selling in the floodplain. So thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for the information. It does appear that we have a couple questions. If anyone else has a question, now's the time to get it in. The first question is, can flood insurance be transferred from the current seller to the new buyer?
To that is, in most cases, yes, a current policy is transferable, and it typically would be transferable at the same glide path. In other words, if it's a subsidized policy, there are annual increases on a glide path to get that policy at some point in the future to be closer to the actuarial rates. So if the policy is transferable, you definitely want to do that. There are some instances where a policy is not transferable. Again, I think if the home is being used for a different reason, like primary versus secondary, or some other things that, again, I might not be aware of, Tom Young is the person to call about that. He, if you have the current policy in hand, he can look it up and he can give you the lowdown on that policy and all of its wonderful benefits for a future buyer.
Okay, another question I have here. Is flood insurance only required if you have a mortgage on the property?
The answer is, if you have a federally backed mortgage on a property that's in the FEMA special flood hazard area, then the lender is mandated by law to impose a flood insurance policy. So there's a couple of little things there. If it's not a federally backed mortgage, which I personally wouldn't want, apparently there are one or two of those out there in the world, then that would not be required. And also, if the property can be shown that the structure is not in the special flood hazard area, then the lender may lift that requirement, although they're not required to. And again, anytime there's a property in or near the special flood hazard area, we totally recommend that people have a flood insurance policy, because again, remember, you have 5 times more chance of flood damages over the life of a 30-year mortgage than you do from a fire.
Next question is, how long does it take to get a letter of amendment?
Map amendment is a relatively simple process. Again, I mentioned it's free. There are certain documents that need to be produced along with the letter of map amendment, primarily an elevation certificate, a current elevation certificate. But once FEMA gets that, I would say within a couple of weeks, they turn that around, to my knowledge, unless there are some other factors on that, such as a coastal dune is involved, then they have to get a little bit extra set of eyes on that. But typically, we see a letter of map amendment coming back in 2 to 3 weeks max.
Okay, does a structure in the B zone require flood insurance?
Special flood hazard area on FEMA's maps. The letter V indicates that the damages would not only be from rising waters of a flood, but also from the power of wave actions. And so that's what differentiates a V zone from an A zone, is wave damage. Definitely there is much more risk of damage to a structure in a V zone than there is in an A zone. So again, if there's a federally backed mortgage involved, a flood insurance policy would be required.
How often do the flood maps get read?
It's kind of a sticky question. FEMA changes their priorities about every 10 years as to what Congress has directed them to do as most important. And about 15 years ago, Congress told them they wanted the coastal areas of the country remapped. And so FEMA has spent the last 10 or 12 years remapping the coastal areas. They probably won't really do a major overhaul of the coastal maps anytime in the near future. There are exceptions, of course, but all of these things cost money, and so FEMA does pretty much have to follow Congress's priorities. Right now, FEMA is kind of cleaning up some of the maps in Massachusetts that haven't had as much detail. And now instead of coastal area maps, they are going watershed by watershed. So there are maps underway that are changing slowly over time. And certainly call me or call Eric if you have a particular community in mind and you want to know what's the mapping status for that community, and we can look it up and tell you.
If the home is outside the flood area, but the land is not, is the home?
So the question was, if the home is outside the special flood hazard area, but the land is not, is the home covered? When you use the word covered, I'm presuming you mean covered by a policy. Again, in the example that we gave, the home that had that letter of map amendment, the home itself was the lowest floor of the structure was 3 feet above the base flood elevation. So FEMA determined that that structure was not in the special flood hazard area. Therefore, the lender would not have to impose a flood insurance policy, although again, they have the option of doing that if they feel that their risk is high enough. It's their investment after all. So, so the home, when you say the home would be covered, if you have a policy on it, yes, the policy contains 2 portions, building content or building coverage and contents coverage. So that would be completely up to what the policy states. I hope that answered the question.
If a property is raised on piers to a level above a flood zone, does it require flood insurance if mortgaged?
If a property is elevated above the flood, it is still in the special flood hazard area. So yes, it would be required to have a policy if it has a mortgage. Again, let me go back to that letter of map amendment that we used as an example. That structure was on a bit of a hill. And so the hill itself, the grade or the ground, is what lifted that property up above the base flood level by 3 feet. It wasn't necessarily how the structure was built in that case. So that's a little bit of a difference between a house on pilings over a flood hazard area versus a home that's lifted up by the ground itself. I hope that's clear.
If there's no mortgage, is flood insurance?
Insurance is not required, but caution to the owner, you still can suffer flood damages, and you know, you may want to at least investigate what a flood policy would cost.
What is the difference from a federal policy and a private policy, and are they both accepted?
Okay, great question. There are many differences. Well, let me back up. There can be many differences between a National Flood Insurance Program policy, an FIP policy, and a private policy, because throughout the country, there are varying limits, restrictions, rules, laws, whatever you would have on how a private insurer can write a policy. Whereas the NFIP policies are all written under the same set of rules across the country. As far as which are they acceptable, it's up to the lender. Typically, a lender, I think the law says that a lender must accept an NFIP policy or its equivalent, but that was never actually defined as to what its equivalent means. And so I think a lender can accept a private policy if the lender feels comfortable with that, but they don't have to. I can say that a few years ago, there were very few private policies being written. Now there are many, many more private policies being written. And now many of those policies are really truly equivalent to the NFIP policy. But a policyholder would have to be really aware of all of the options and sleight of hand or ways that a policy would not actually be the same. So that's something that a policyholder would really want to do their homework on and really trust their insurance agent. One thing I can say is an NFIP policy is not revocable unless the community does something that gets them thrown out of the program. But an insurance policy by a private insurer can be canceled, a couple of years after a loss if they just decide that the property is too risky. They can just choose not to insure it anymore, which FEMA would not do.
Does flood insurance cover wind damage in a coastal area?
No, a flood insurance policy does not cover wind damage anywhere.